Today, we're diving into the case of Samuel Little, known as one of the most deadliest individuals in America's history. With over 90 confirmed confessions spanning decades, Little's case is a haunting tale of systemic failures, cold-blooded offenses, and crimes that left a lasting mark on American history. How did he manage to evade authorities for so long? And what led to his capture after decades of horrific crimes? Samuel Little was born on June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia. Reynolds was a small rural town characterized by its close-knit community and traditional Southern values. The town's economy was primarily based on agriculture, and life moved at a slower pace compared to the bustling cities. Little's early years in Reynolds were marked by the simplicity and hardships of rural life during that era. Raised primarily by his grandmother in Ohio, Little's childhood was fraught with difficulties. His family moved to Lorain, Ohio, when he was still very young. Lorain, an industrial town, was a vast contrast to the rural setting of Reynolds. The move was supposed to offer better opportunities, but for Little, it brought a new set of challenges. His grandmother, who took on the role of his primary caregiver, struggled to provide the stability and guidance he needed. He was often in trouble and rarely attended school. Little's truancy was not just a sign of rebellion, but also a cry for help. He found it difficult to fit in with his peers and often felt isolated. The lack of a stable family environment contributed to his behavioral issues. His grandmother, despite her best efforts, could not keep him on the right path. Little's frequent absences from school led to poor academic performance, further alienating him from the educational system. Reports from those who knew him in his early years describe him as troubled, often defiant, and quick to anger. Teachers and neighbors recalled a boy who was difficult to manage, prone to outbursts, and resistant to authority. His defiance was not just limited to school, it extended to his interactions with family and community members. This behavior set the stage for a tumultuous adolescence. Little struggled academically and dropped out of high school, setting him on a trajectory of frequent brushes with the law, initially for minor crimes like theft and vandalism. Dropping out of school closed many doors for him, limiting his opportunities for legitimate employment. As a result, he turned to petty crime as a means of survival. His early criminal record was filled with minor offenses, but each arrest and conviction pushed him further away from a conventional life. Even as a teenager, Little exhibited signs of violence and an obsessive fascination with women. His interactions with women were often inappropriate and aggressive. This behavior was a precursor to the more violent tendencies that would emerge later in his life. Friends and acquaintances from his teenage years noted his unsettling behavior, but few could have predicted the dark path he would eventually take. Early on, his criminal activities revolved around theft and burglary, but as he grew older, they began to take a darker turn. His crimes became more brazen and violent, reflecting his growing disregard for the law and societal norms. The escalation in his criminal behavior was a clear indication of his deepening descent into a life of crime. Each new offense was more serious than the last, signaling a dangerous trajectory. In the 1960s, Little moved frequently, living a transient lifestyle and drifting through states like Ohio, Florida, and California. His transient lifestyle made it difficult for law enforcement to keep track of him. He would often move to a new state to avoid arrest or to start fresh after committing a crime. This constant movement also meant that he never established strong ties or a support system, further isolating him and enabling his criminal behavior. He survived largely by committing petty crimes, with occasional stints in prison, which ultimately laid the groundwork for his more violent criminal undertakings. Each stint in prison exposed him to more hardened criminals and more sophisticated criminal techniques. Instead of being rehabilitated, Little used his time in prison to learn and refine his criminal skills. This period of his life was a critical juncture, setting the stage for the more heinous crimes he would commit in the future. Throughout the 1970s, Samuel Little escalated his crimes, often targeting women on the margins of society, those struggling with addiction and individuals experiencing homelessness, and women who have no other option but to work on the streets. These women, already living precarious lives, became easy prey for Little's predatory instincts. He exploited their vulnerabilities, knowing that their disappearances would not attract immediate attention from law enforcement or the public. The societal neglect of these marginalized groups created a perfect storm for Little to operate with impunity. These women were largely overlooked by society, making it easier for Little to avoid detection. The lack of social support systems and the stigmatization of their lifestyles meant that their absences were often unnoticed or dismissed. This societal indifference provided Little with a cloak of invisibility, allowing him to continue his heinous acts without fear of immediate repercussions. His preferred method was strangulation, a chillingly personal and brutal technique. Strangulation requires close physical contact, making it a deeply intimate form of violence. This method not only satisfied Little's sadistic desires, but also ensured that he left minimal forensic evidence behind. The act of strangling someone is prolonged and deliberate, giving the perpetrator a sense of control and power over the victim's life. This choice was strategic. Strangulation left little evidence, often leading medical examiners to mistakenly rule his victim's demise as accidental overdoses or natural causes. The lack of visible injuries and the absence of weapon marks made it difficult for authorities to identify foul play. In many cases, the victims' lifestyles lead to these misdiagnoses, as their passings were easily attributed to drug overdoses or health complications related to their living conditions. Little would later confess that he was drawn to strangling his victims because he could feel their life leaving. This chilling admission reveals the depth of his depravity and the pleasure he derived from his crimes. The act of strangulation allowed him to experience a perverse sense of intimacy with his victims as he watched the life drain from their eyes. This macabre fascination with the end drove him to continue his evil slayings, leaving a trail of devastation in his wake. During this period, authorities in various states failed to connect his crimes, largely due to the lack of communication between jurisdictions. The fragmented nature of law enforcement agencies meant that information about similar cases was not shared across state lines. This lack of coordination allowed Little to exploit the gaps in the system, moving from state to state and evading capture. Each jurisdiction treated the murders as isolated incidents, unaware that they were dealing with a serial killer. With no central database or DNA registry, each murder was treated as an isolated case. The absence of modern forensic technology and the lack of a unified crime database hindered the investigation process. Detectives working on individual cases had no way of knowing that similar crimes were occurring in other states. This disjointed approach allowed Little to continue his murder spree without raising suspicion. His crimes were committed in different states, California, Texas, and Ohio, to name a few, making it nearly impossible to see a pattern. The geographical spread of his murders further complicated the efforts to link the cases. Each state had its own law enforcement protocols and priorities, which meant that the investigations were not coordinated. Little's ability to travel freely and commit crimes in multiple locations made it difficult for authorities to track his movements and establish a connection between the murders. While he was arrested multiple times, either for theft, assault, or attempted murder, he repeatedly evaded long-term incarceration due to insufficient evidence or lack of witness testimony. The transient nature of his victims and the lack of concrete evidence made it challenging for prosecutors to build a strong case against him. Witnesses were often reluctant to come forward, either out of fear or because they were part of the marginalized communities that society ignored. This allowed Little to slip through the cracks of the justice system time and again. Each time he was released, Little returned to his violent tendencies, continuing his deadly spree unchecked. The cycle of arrest and release only emboldened him as he realized that he could continue his crimes with little fear of long-term consequences. The failure of the criminal justice system to keep him behind bars meant that more lives were lost and more families were left to grieve the loss of their loved ones. Little's story is a reminder of the importance of effective law enforcement coordination and the need to address the systemic issues that allow predators to thrive. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, law enforcement agencies in different cities were beginning to accumulate cases of unsolved murders, particularly of women fitting a similar profile. These women were often marginalized, living on the fringes of society, making them easy targets for a predator who knew how to exploit the system's weaknesses. The victims were frequently found in similar conditions, and the brutality of the crimes suggested a single perpetrator with a specific modus operandi. Despite some similarities in the crimes, including the method of strangulation and the transient nature of the suspect, investigators didn't link these cases. Each police department worked in isolation, focusing on their own jurisdictions without considering the possibility of a serial killer operating across state lines. The lack of advanced forensic technology and databases further hindered their ability to connect the dots. Detectives were often overworked and under-resourced, struggling to keep up with the mounting caseloads. The lack of coordinated communication and centralized information sharing among law enforcement agencies across states allowed Little to stay one step ahead. He exploited the gaps in the system, moving from one place to another, leaving a trail of victims in his wake. The fragmented nature of law enforcement at the time meant that crucial information about his movements and methods was not shared, allowing him to evade capture repeatedly. This disjointed approach to policing created an environment where a cunning and mobile criminal could thrive. In 1982, Little was brought in for the murder of a woman in Pascagoula, Mississippi, but a grand jury ultimately did not indict him due to lack of evidence. The case against him was weak, relying heavily on circumstantial evidence and the testimonies of witnesses who were often unreliable or unwilling to come forward. The legal system's failure to secure a conviction was a devastating blow to the families of the victims and a missed opportunity to stop a dangerous predator. This was yet another missed opportunity to stop his violent streak. Each time Little slipped through the cracks, he grew bolder, confident in his ability to outsmart the authorities. The missed chances to apprehend him were not just failures of individual police departments, but a systemic issue that highlighted the need for better coordination and communication among law enforcement agencies. The consequences of these missed opportunities were tragic, as more women fell victim to his heinous crimes. After a brief period of imprisonment in the late 80s for assaulting 2 women, Little moved to Los Angeles, where he continued his crimes. The city, already grappling with a high crime rate, became his new hunting ground. The sheer volume of cases overwhelmed the local authorities, making it difficult for them to dedicate the necessary resources to investigate each incident thoroughly. Little took advantage of this chaos, targeting vulnerable women who were often overlooked by society and the justice system. The authorities in LA, however, were overwhelmed by a rising crime rate and didn't have the resources to adequately investigate each case involving marginalized women. The city's law enforcement was stretched thin, dealing with a surge in violent crimes, gang activity, and drug-related offenses. In this environment, cases involving women from marginalized communities received less attention, allowing Little to continue his spree with little fear of being caught. The systemic issues within the police force, combined with societal indifference towards the victims, created a perfect storm that enabled Little's continued violence. The era highlighted the urgent need for reforms in law enforcement practices. Training programs began to emphasize the importance of interagency communication and the use of emerging technologies to track and apprehend serial offenders. Seminars and conferences were held to address the gaps in the system, but for many victims, these changes came too late. The lessons learned from this period would eventually lead to significant improvements in how serial crimes were investigated, but the cost of these lessons was measured in lives lost and families shattered. Today, the advancements in forensic science, DNA analysis, and centralized databases have transformed the way law enforcement tackles serial crimes. The mistakes of the past have informed the practices of the present, ensuring that the missed opportunities of the 1980s are not repeated. However, the story of Samuel Little serves as a stark reminder of the importance of vigilance, coordination, and the relentless pursuit of justice for all victims, regardless of their background or circumstances. The legacy of those missed opportunities is carried on by the families of the victims and advocacy groups who continue to fight for justice and reform. Their efforts have brought about changes in how law enforcement approaches cases involving marginalized individuals, ensuring that no victim is overlooked or forgotten. The memory of those who suffered at the hands of Samuel Little serves as a powerful catalyst for ongoing efforts to improve the criminal justice system and protect the most vulnerable members of society. In the early 2000s, advancements in DNA technology allowed law enforcement to re-examine cold cases with new tools. In 2012, Samuel Little was arrested in Kentucky on narcotic charges, and this time, investigators took a DNA sample that would change everything. When his DNA was entered into the national database, it matched samples from 3 unsolved murders in Los Angeles from the late 1980s. With these matches, detectives realized they had a potential serial killer on their hands. The victims, Carol Alford, Audrey Nelson and Guadalupe Apodaca, had all been strangled. Little denied involvement, but the DNA evidence was undeniable. He was charged with multiple counts of murder and faced trial in Los Angeles. During his time in prison, Samuel Little began to open up about his crimes. In a series of interviews with Texas Ranger James Holland, Little confessed to over 90 murders. These confessions were meticulously detailed, with Little providing descriptions of his victims, locations, and even sketches he drew from memory. His remarkable memory of each woman he claimed to have killed helped investigators connect dots in cases that had been unsolved for decades. In one of his interviews, Little chillingly described his motivations and explained how he would carefully choose his victims. He preferred women who were, in his words, out of touch with society, believing they would be less likely to be missed or thoroughly investigated. As a result, many of his victims' cases had either gone cold or been dismissed as accidental. His confessions led to the solving of dozens of cases, offering closure to some families after years of uncertainty. Samuel Little passed in 2020, but his case remains one of the most chilling examples of how a serial unaliver can evade justice for decades. His crimes exposed serious gaps in the US criminal justice system, including the need for better communication between jurisdictions and greater focus on cold cases involving vulnerable victims. Little's ability to evade detection for so long has led to changes in how law enforcement agencies handle cases involving missing and murdered individuals from marginalized communities. Samuel Little's case reminds us of the importance of recognizing the humanity and dignity of each victim, and the necessity for a justice system that works tirelessly to protect all individuals, regardless of their status or circumstances. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more true crime stories.